Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. This week we're going to look at a collage. The title was Contrasts of Nature and it was designed to be 80 centimetres tall, 60 centimetres wide and displayed on an easel that's provided by the organisers of the competition. Before I talk about the design itself, I want to just talk a little bit about collages in floral art, because many of us coming from a creative background will think of a collage and think, well, I know what that is. It's just a combination of things that is a flat presentation, and mostly paper, sometimes a little bit of texture with wool or other elements, but predominantly a flat presentation. In floral art, it's very different in that it needs to be 3D. There still needs to be depth in the design, and so the hardest thing I think for us as designers when we're doing a collage for a competition is to find that depth in the design. Certainly we can make it almost 2D, but it's the 3D effect that we really need, and I'll talk as I go through about how I've done that or how I thought I'd done it, depending on what sort of a review we get from the AI, and some suggestions for other ways. Now, one of the most common questions that I get is about water sources for a collage, because collage is generally a glued presentation, I think the right word, and so water vials are usually the first choice for people. With a competition, it's often that if you're using plastic vials, you need to cover them, and that's fine, but there are alternatives as well. So if you're using very small stems or small flowers, you can give yourself justification for buying a packet of water bomb balloons. So they're very tiny balloons, and what's good about them is that you can put a little bit of water in them and then tie them to the end of the stem, and they come in colours, so you can match the colour to the colours that you're using in your collage. So a good alternative to trying to find little tiny vials of any description. You can wax the bottom of the stem so long as the fresh material is hydrated really well. So it's just dipping in that end of that stem a couple of times into some hot wax and letting it cool. It will seal off that part of the plant, so the water that is in the stem will be contained and keep it going for the duration of the show, so long as you're only looking at 2 or 3 days of a show. You can think about using plant materials that are fresh when you use them but don't require a water source. So here in this design I've used some tillandsia, which is an air plant basically, but you could use succulents as well, cacti, where they don't need a constant water source in terms of the show length that your work will be on display. And you can also use items that are like that in terms of they don't need a water source for the show, and they will dry naturally. So that's for me, it's things like Banksias and Status, where I can put them fresh into a design and they'll have their green tinge to them, but as they dry, they'll lose a little bit of that, but they don't lose, particularly the Status doesn't lose a whole lot of colour when it dries, and so it still remains appropriate for your design. So there's a few ways of thinking about using plant material and thinking about your fresh plant material components in a collage. The other thing I want to warn you about in terms of a collage is make sure that you've read the schedule or you've asked the organisers about how much fresh plant material they expect to see, the judges will expect to see in this particular design. There should be a percentage or a statement to say that the fresh plant material has to dominate, or it might just say that some fresh plant material needs to be used. In that way you can do mostly with dried or unglued materials and then have your fresh plant material as a bit of a feature in the design. So with that, I will talk now about this particular design. So some of you might notice that the base structure, the framework, is a metal tea light stand, an outdoor one that you put on a wall outside near a barbecue or something. But it's turned, it normally is presented horizontally, it's turned vertically for this particular design. And I have taken the backing off and just left the metal squares and covered up the cups where the tea lights would normally go with the plant material, the vials, and sometimes with the wood slices. The back of the metallic frame I've covered with a handmade paper that has plants impressed in it, and then the squares, the coloured squares, so the green and the pink, is sisal, which is a plant derived material, some bark, paper bark, shown both ways, so external and internal, to give me the colour variation. A couple of branches with some lichen and some moss on them, and the tillandsia, wood slices, some statice and roses. And I would say I've put the roses in because we had to use roses on that day, because you know I'm not very adept at using roses in my design. And there's a fern leaf there as well, just for a little bit of a change in form, and to give the line, the reflection of the lines, but not in the vertical or diagonal way the other plant material might be. All of that is placed on a white canvas artboard, and that was so that I could extend it out to closer to the size that it was supposed to be. And as I look at it now, that white stands out so much for me, because the backing up behind the frame is off-white. I really should have painted that outside to match that as well, or covered it with more of the plant impressed paper. The branches, as you'll see, I've got extending out beyond the top of the frame, and that's to try and increase the height a little bit, because it was still a little bit short in terms of what it needed to be for judging. So let's now have a look at AI, our design eye, and see what it has got to say about this particular design. Looking at line, first of all, there's a powerful direct dialogue between the lines in this piece. The sharp, structured, vertical and horizontal black lines of the framework contrast completely with the sweeping, unpredictable diagonal line of the primary branch. That's very true, and that was something that I wanted to do. I wanted to break up that very dominant vertical and horizontal lines in the framework and bring the plant material to the fore, so not have the design defined by something that wasn't plant material. The risk I take in doing this is that that branch contradicts or crosses the lines that are being created visually with that framework, and so I have to be reasonably careful about where I place it and make sure that it covers the whole of the design, not just across one corner, because if it was across one corner, it would cut off that corner. You would see that as a line that cuts off that section of the design. So it takes a little bit of time to work out the placement so that it incorporates itself into the design and isn't looking like it's splitting the design up. Texture. This is where the design truly shines. You have an incredible textural playground: the crusty, brittle lichen, the rough peeling bark, the delicate fibrous mesh, the pink and the green, the smooth canvas backing, and the soft velvet petals of the fresh blooms. There is a whole lot of texture in there. There's probably enough textural contrast, I think, to there's smooth and there's rough. Certainly that's the first thing that hits you. And then there's a little bit of contrast too in the soft and the harder edges, but there's not, I suppose the branch you could consider as a hard edge. I was just thinking there's not much hard edge on the timber slices as well. Forget what I said. There's good contrast of texture in this design. We shall move on to form. So form, you've successfully merged geometric forms, the rectangular colour blocks and the circular wooden discs, with natural organic forms. The collage remains relatively flat, with just enough 3D projection from the branch and vials to create shadowing and depth. So this is what I talked about earlier. It's about getting that depth in the design. And I think I could have done better in getting the depth in the design. I need the plant material, the flowers particularly, to pop out more, whether it's a visual 3D effect or whether it's an actual effect. And the branch needs to come out a little bit more as well, because it gets lost. So it's okay when it's got the background of all the other materials, but as it goes away from the white top of that canvas backing, it gets a little bit lost in what else is around it. And it's very much the same as I talked to you about having a baseboard when you're doing staging on a bench to separate your design from the supporting structure around it. So you can see in this one, because the branch goes beyond the white and the backing is black, it gets lost in that, and so it's almost like it's not part of the design. You really have to look at it carefully to see that it is still part of the design. Colour. The foundational palette relies on muted earth tones of creams, browns and natural greens. This allows the vibrant pops of pink, magenta mesh and the bright warm colours of the fresh floral groupings to act as visual magnets. They do. What I'm concerned about when I look at it is I'm drawn to that very bright pink, and it's not reflected anywhere else. It's not reflected in the flowers that are there. So what I should have had, rather than the red rose, is to have a pinker rose, something that's closer to that, the hot pink of the sisal that's in the block colours there. And the flowers themselves need to be more dominant than they are. The status you can see, but it's really lost in that bottom corner, and I needed to mass it better so that it was a mass of green and yellow and have it reflected somewhere else, which I've just noticed I haven't done. So we'll see if I get into trouble for that as well. But I just feel in looking at it now that the proportion and the scale is not quite there in terms of those fresh plant material placings. Contrast. The absolute driving force of the design. You have masterfully contrasted geometric versus organic, dried versus fresh, rough versus smooth, and static versus dynamic. And this is really important because it is so easy to think of a contrast of one of those principles or elements of design. So I could have just done contrast of lines. I could have and just had the straight lines and the curved lines. I could have done a contrast of colour. I could have done a contrast of texture. And the fact that what it's saying is that I've contrasted a number of things adds to the strength of my interpretation of the class title. Balance. The design utilises asymmetrical balance. The visual weight of the heavy diagonal branch and the dense bulk panels on the left is balanced by the negative space, the brightly coloured panels and the floral placements distributed across the right and lower quadrants. It is balanced. It's almost too balanced. And I think maybe that's because it's a little bit flat as well. And I think what's coming into it now in my head is that proportion and scale of the fresh plant material. And I just would like to make them a bit bigger. Can't do it. Rhythm. The repetition of the circular wooden discs acts like stepping stones, creating a rhythmic pathway that guides the viewer's eye across the grid and around the textural panels. This was a very deliberate move of mine. When I had done all of the design, I then had the discs and I deliberately placed them so that there was this movement through the design, because I felt that although there's movement with the branch, there was nothing else that made you look around and through the design. You'd look at individual spots in the design, and that's a reflection of how structured that backing metallic frame is. And so I needed to break that up with something that makes you wander through the design. So I'm glad that achieved that goal of mine. Dominance and emphasis. The dominant feature is undoubtedly the diagonal lichen branch. It breaks the rules of the grid, stepping out of the boundary frame, which adds immense visual interest. It does, and I'm surprised that the AI sees that as the dominant part of the design, probably because it is away from that backing, which is very flat with the rest of the placements. And so that's a good thing that it was plant material that was the dominant part of the design, and that it sees that by its size and its shape that it has broken up that background grid, and so we're not being drawn to the metallic non-natural structure as being the dominant part of the design. You would always want plant material, fresh or dried, to be the dominant part of your design. So let's move on to some suggestions and see what I could do to improve it. The design received a highly commended in this competition, And from memory, I don't think that there was a first place given. And I think there was only a second place and the highly commended. And that's part and parcel of what happens at this competition. If they don't feel a design is up to a first placing, they don't award it. So it's an interesting approach. And I don't mind it. I think it keeps us all working hard to maintain a standard, and that's important in terms of these competitions as well. So suggestions. Number 1 is integration of mechanics. In a collage, marrying the fresh materials to the dry background is technically demanding. The wrapped water vials containing the fresh materials sit slightly on top of the design. To increase unity, you could tuck these water sources behind the bark or mesh panels, allowing the fresh flowers to appear as though they are bursting directly out of the 2D plane. I think that's a really, really useful suggestion, because it would be a simple matter to be able to do that. It would mean that the plastic vials would still be covered because they'd be contained behind those panels, and it would make the depth of the design so much more obvious, and I get a bit of shadowing as well, and it would help it pop out and make that plant material really be the dominant part of the design, a feature of the design, the hero of the design, as we say. Number 2 is visual weight distribution. The floral cluster in the bottom left carries a lot of visual weight. To create a slightly tighter cohesive tension, a tiny touch of that same warm yellow or orange could be echoed in the top right quadrant to pull the viewer's eye all the way up to the diagonal branch. Did I not say this earlier? Did I not say that this was a problem for me looking at it now, all these years later? So I totally agree with it. And I really think, apart from the doing that, I think that there's a need for some more visual weight in terms of the scale and the proportion, as I've said all along. So number 3 is border containment. The main branch extending past the top frame is a great dynamic choice. However, where it exits, it crosses the frame quite abruptly. Softening that specific exit point with some small piece of overlapping lichen or mesh could make the boundary break feel even more intentional. I think that's very true. I think I need to feature that part where it breaks through that metallic frame and the top frame as well. And I think that I tried to do that with the tillandsia. I'm looking at the image thinking I don't think I remember trying to wrap it around a little bit to make it look like it was coming out through that framework, but it needs a little bit more work. So another really good suggestion. So 3 very good suggestions that I would take on board for this particular interpretation and design. Well, there we have our analysis for this week. I hope that has given you some things to think about and things to apply in your own floral design work. Join me next week for yet another delve into the archives of my competition pieces and an analysis that we can take apart together. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.